Hey guys, so in this lesson we are going to look at how to get your drops hitting harder, because regardless of the genre of EDM you're producing, we always love a nice big fat meaty drop. Now this is the ultimate EDM mixing course, so we're not going to go too much into composition and music theory, but I will touch upon it because it's such a fundamental part of getting your drops to hit harder. So a drop is always preceded by a build up, and how that build up sets that drop up is largely responsible for how big that drop's going to sound. So having a hard hitting drop is down to two things really. One is building tension in the build up and then releasing it on the drop. And the second is contrast. So if a drop is full energy, so you've got full frequency range, you've got full volume and full stereo field, the build up has to contrast that and have less energy. If you had a full power build up and a full power drop, you don't really have a drop because there's very little, if any, contrast. So let's look at the tools that we have at our disposal for getting these harder drops, especially within the mixing process, as that's what we're focusing on. Now there are 10 ways. The first 3 are not mixing, they are composition, but I'm going to touch upon them because they're really important anyway. So the first is drum rolls or repeated samples, and you all know what this sounds like in dance music, and depending on the type of EDM you're producing, you might use more or less of these. For instance, big room EDM or drum and bass is going to have loads of snare rolls, whereas a genre like deep house is probably going to have fewer. But just listen to some examples of similar songs in your genre to get an idea of what you should be doing. And we can't really go into polyrhythms and how they work in this course, but if you want to find out more about them, check out the Music Theory for EDM Producers course. So tip number 2 is using sustained or suspended chords. Again, this is a music theory thing, so we won't go into it too much. But if you listen to Energy, which is the song that we mixed through in the last module, just listen to what happens to the chords just before the drop. And it holds on this note before going back to the full chord sequence. And what that does is just create tension and anticipation. Okay, number 3 is the last of the 3 composition tips, and this is pitch bends and risers. Again, you probably already know this in your compositions, but you can automate it in the music production stage. It's a bit harder to do in the mixing stage, so this should already be done. You can hear these effects. They're all rising, building the tension. Standard stuff, but a great way to build tension in the build up towards a drop. Again, some genres it's going to be more appropriate than others. Okay, on to the mixing tips for increasing the impact of your drop. Now the first is filtering out the low frequencies and also some of the upper frequencies if we want as well. So if we listen to our drums here, solo them, we can see here we've got a high pass filter. And we're just going to automate the frequency up to take out that low energy. And you can do this with the bass lines as well. Very good for the bass lines. And then when the drop hits, all of the frequencies come back in. And you can also do it a little bit with the top frequencies as well, just to take some of that high-end shine out. But I would barely ever go between 13 kilohertz on the low pass filter, because you don't want to take away too much energy, and the high frequencies can often give a lot of energy to a build-up as well. So if you are going to roll those off, I wouldn't do it below about 13 kilohertz. And of course, make sure all frequencies are firing at full range when you hit the drop. And again, these frequencies can be used on any of the channels, or you could even do it on the master if you wanted, but I prefer to have a bit more control in case I want a bit of sub bass in there from. So those horn stabs, I wanted a bit more bass in there than I did with the drums, so I didn't roll off the low end with those. Okay, tip number 5 is volume automation. Now, when I started producing, I used to think that automating throughout the course of a mix was actually kind of cheating and that you should be able to set up your sounds right so they just work. But actually, as we discussed in the dynamic mixing stage, this is a great way to add more interest and especially more impact on your drop. So with the drums, for instance, you can see we've just got a utility plugin, and in the break and the build up, we've got about minus 3.5 dBs. And when it kicks in, back to 0 decibels. And that really makes that first beat pop out the speakers. And again, you can do this with any or all of the elements to really make them hit in when that drop hits. Tip number 6 is reverb and delay automation. And this is just automating some reverb. So we're doing this on the drums here, using the dry wet knob, which pushes the sound further back in the mixing space. And then right back to the front in your face. And that is great for just sucking out a bit of energy before whapping it back in on the drop. Tip number 7, don't feel that you should be constrained by just volume, frequency and reverb or delay. You can do this with other effects as well. So let's have a go with a bit crusher, for instance. It's called the Redux in Ableton. And let's listen to what happens when we automate this. And it's all about automation, really. So it just gives it more contrast, and you can do this with flanges, with phasers, you could do this with a saturator even, and it's just a subtle effect to make a bigger contrast between the build-up and the drop. Okay, tip number 8, and this is massive. This will make you stand out more than just automating these standard effects. This is where you can automate your parallel compression channel on and off. So in the drop, we've got our parallel compression hitting. Solo it. So that's our very, very heavily compressed channel that we've just brought up slightly under the rest of the mix just to give it some real energy. And all we do is we just turn it off with automation during the break and the build up. So when that drop hits, you just automate that channel back on. And it just gives more energy underneath the mix. And that is one of my favorites. So you've got volume, reverb, filtering, and the parallel compression automation. Those are the ones that I use every time. Okay, number 9. Now this is stereo field automation. And you'll know that throughout the whole course, I've always said stereo should be the last thing you look at because it's the least important out of all the dimensions in the 4D mixing space. And that's true in my opinion, but it doesn't mean we can't use it to our benefit when making bigger impacts on the drop. If you're in Ableton, you can use a utility plugin and just automate the width down from 100% to something like 50% or even 0%, and then whack it back to 100% on the drop. So it's just bringing the mix narrower and narrower, and your ears can't really tell it's doing that until you have this big contrast. And the last of my 10 tips for getting your drops to hit harder is using silence and micro edits. And this is a great reason to use audio stems because it makes it really easy and you've got lots of control. And what this is basically editing in a tiny bit of silence just before that first transient on the drop, just to give a greater contrast, because obviously complete silence and full frequency range, full volume, full stereo field is an even bigger contrast and makes your drop hit harder. But don't worry if you're not using audio stems, because you can just automate the volume on each channel that you want to take down to silence and then put them back to full volume on the drop. Now I always do this with a plugin in the chain rather than on the channel fader itself, in case you want to adjust the levels in your static mix a bit later. And we can see here that I've already done this. I've just created silence just before the drop. Now some of these stems don't have audio there anyway, but don't forget to do this on the auxiliary channels as well, because of course we've added reverb and delay throughout the process of mixing. That's still playing. So you can hear it takes time to die out. So remember to automate volume on these auxiliary channels as well. Now, it doesn't need to be this specific length of silence, it might just be a couple of milliseconds. But the important thing, having this tiny bit of silence before the drop, gives it that bigger impact. And there you have it. They are my top 10 tips for making your drops hit harder. I hope you enjoyed these and try them out in your mix.